Hello everyone, today we talk about the ideological relation between early Christianity and the Roman military, and more specifically we will take a look at Pauline thought towards the idea of the Christian and as well as the secular militia of the time. So this is a huge topic that we can't address in a single YouTube video. We would also have to introduce, generally speaking, what was the military thought in Judaism, what Jesus actually defined the militia like as the Christian militia. So with St. Paul, you know that effectively there is a kind of an autonomous thinking that brings effectively the Christianity to spread. First of all, I mean, if Christianity reached the expansion and the importance it had historically, it is exclusively to St. Paul. Without him, it would have remained just as one of the other Jewish sects that existed, by the way, at the time. We would, I don't know, might have survived, but it would have had a completely different fate. So St. Paul is an extremely important source, naturally, for his letters, in his, and his importance, despite not being an apostle, actually being seemingly part of the group that initially killed the first Christian martyr, that was Saint Stephen, and also having arguments eventually in a completely different perspective, though, with Saint Peter in Rome, that effectively seems to try to kill him at one point, is definitely a pillar of Christian Western thought and civilization, and from his ideas, we can say that the world history was changed forever. And the relation with the Roman military is particularly important because it was not only, or merely at least ideologically, it also kind of encompassed certain parts of his life. He was arrested by the Roman authorities, actually in a kind of this brought to his protection at the end of the day, and as a Roman citizen, being a Jew but also a Roman citizen, he was fully aware, in fact, of the civic value of the military and its importance. And we will see that naturally this doesn't bring actually to a militarization of the Christian thought at all. There is a very clear separation between the two things in terms of, in fact, Christian militia and secular militia, at least in Pauline thought. But nevertheless, the concept of Christian militia heavily borrowed its symbolism, its even its lexicon and ideology from the Roman military, that was effectively the imperial military, in fact, of the universal empire of the time, the empire where Christianity was born, and that was come to effectively rule in fundamentally less than 4 centuries even, and therefore having to deal now with also the relation with power, with bearing arms, etc. So this is extremely wide, but today I would just really like to focus on the single statements that Paul made relatively to militia, to the military service, metaphorically, but also concretely meant, and showing how effectively the Roman model was strongly present in it. So this is a very important perspective, in my opinion, to take into consideration in the first place, because of the heavy influence that and certain interpretations that have spread since the Enlightenment, etc. There's been this idea that for some reason Christianity either weakened or brought to the decay of the Roman Empire. Now, historiographically speaking, nobody believes in such things anymore. It is not an ideological stand, it's not a political stand, it is effectively devoid of any historical evidence, especially when you talk about the military. The Roman military remained at all times, even during Christian times, the most efficient military machine ever existed. Christian morality, as a matter of fact, didn't at all interfere into this. The resistance, let's say the resistance to levy, etc., were episodic events. We know that Christians participated to the army, and in fact, even before the Roman military became Christian by state, and there is no evidence, even in further centuries. I mean, I've read studies from 7th century Byzantine Empire looking at the military ethos of the Byzantine troops. It was basically and surprisingly unchanged from classical times. I mean, the concepts of heroism, of, let's say, of blood, praising bloodshed and killing the enemy, etc., was always there. What was said in the ecumenic councils, in this kind of ideological conception of the empire as the new theories of let's say, of just war in a Christian fashion, is something that effectively existed just in the higher echelons of societies. Things like the army, etc., always work in the same way, and I believe it's pretty evident that throughout history, think about European history and Christian European history, it's been a history of wars like all the rest of the world. So saying that the Roman Empire was weakened by the spread of Christianity this is false at so many levels that it are even difficult to list every one by one. The Christianity enormously strengthened the imperial administration, the functioning, the control of the local communities, etc. So it's wrong at so many levels, but also ideologically speaking, there is no single historical evidence that anything that the Roman army became less warlike because of Christianity is out there. It's absolutely false. It's wrong historically speaking, and it's unfortunately still a very widespread prejudice that exists, in fact, in my opinion, just because of Enlightenment myths that I personally like very much the Enlightenment, but it also produced, like every great ideological movements, good things as well as bad things, or at least misconceptions in this case, since we're talking in an historiographical perspective. And just for saying that even the religious ideals are something, and in reality is something else. But I would say that aside from today's topic, the idea is, I believe that the same Christianity actually accepts, even if it doesn't rationalize it expressly, or at least doesn't expressly rationalize it. It contemplates the idea that fundamentally violence exists in this world, and that by a certain degree, there has to be fundamentally the recognition of certain authority that theoretically the Christian has nothing to do with in terms of spiritual matters, but is still deeply involved and committed into socially speaking, politically speaking. Now, this is an endless debate, because actually if you study the Gospels especially, you find, and also with the Pauline production, you realize that everything is very subtle, very ambiguous, and sometimes even certain translation about phrases, just think about what Jesus says, gives back to Caesar what is of Caesar, and give to God what is of God. Well, that in the real translation is really literally give back to Caesar what is of Caesar. It is not give to Caesar what is Caesar, like putting God and Caesar on a parity level. So it's but at the same time, it doesn't even mean in absolute terms that that the Christian should be only let's say in the material world, just detached from it, or completely forgetful of what reality is around. It's a very complex thinking. It's a very complex question. Let's just say that Christianity actually inherits, and this is pretty evident also in St. Paul, the Jewish tradition of, let's say, not messing up with the local authority. This is also a very important aspect of Judeo-Christianity that set fundamentally the division between, the basis at least for the eventual division between church and state. Is something that in other religions you don't quite have in the same way. Just think about Islam, that is completely different. Nevertheless, I believe that the totalitarian Christian thinking is effectively contemplating in its absolute the happening of certain phenomena, let's say from a political and social point of view, that entail the necessity even of politics and war to effectively exist, and it's the duality of human nature, fundamentally, according to the Judeo-Christian tradition. We are all sinners, so we can't reach perfection. The Gospels offer this model, the Christ-like model that is naturally both divine and human. So there is always this kind of dichotomy that is kind of both things in one at all times. It's very difficult. It's just like thinking about Jesus on the cross. Is Jesus alive or dead when we represent the cross? It's both things at the same time, and it's this dualism that represents not an opposition but a complementarity. So this is also a very important approach in perspective to Christianity that should be taken into consideration when approaching these thoughts, because otherwise I've seen that most of the debates that exist about these things, even on YouTube and in historical videos dedicated to it, is that either you are a theist or an atheist, and basically there is no discussion. There is just a diametrically opposed interpretation of the matter, and if you're from one side, you have just attacked the other, and vice versa. But this is completely missing the point, even from a strictly religious historical perspective, and the way also, in fact, history of religion and of Christianity is studied today. But I started this comparison, let's say, between Christianity and Roman Empire, because even in our mindset, we tend to buy, on average, the idea that, when Christianity effectively developed and spread into the empire was not the one it was before. Well, thanks to my eyes, nothing is what it is before, not even before, and definitely Christianity contributed to transform it, but as we have seen, this didn't entail any kind of decay, but in general mindset is the idea that the Roman Empire was a kind of a modern and secular world, like the 19th century nation state that crumbled to obscurantism and superstition. This is the general interpretation. But what is effectively forgotten is that the Christians and even the early Christians immediately accepted, let's say, the Roman Empire in many ways as a sort of chosen empire. This came from two perspectives. The first one was naturally, providential, divine, and properly Christian, in the idea that Christ was born in an empire that was not the Parthian kingdom, that was not Han China, it was in fact the Roman Empire, and that therefore this had a meaning. This had in the Gospels you find Roman characters, thinking about Pilatus or others, and effectively even in the life of Saint Paul, you realize how being himself a Roman citizen and a Jew, the two things coexist, and you get, in fact, great part of the subtleness of the depth of the Pauline thought exactly through this dual dimension that coexisted and has to be understood, because it's not just about Christians or Jews or any other specific group. Naturally, Jews were kind of some of the most advanced and literate populations in the empire. They lived in a very advanced place with centuries and centuries of civilization in the past, etc. But that was a bit the universal message of the Roman Empire, is that doesn't matter what language you speak, what you look like, or whatever your beliefs are, as long as you're loyal to the empire, as long as you recognize at least the imperial deity that was requested effectively in terms of religious impositions into the empire that, however, brought Christians in trouble because they refused, at least in part, in a radical part, in a narrow part, telling the truth, to accept. You as long as you participated to the empire, you could be a Roman, and you were effectively a Roman. This is the greatness of the empire, and it definitely inspired in itself in this period in history that in fact did the same acme of the Roman Empire as even a healthy political, an healthy power that, however, was at the peak of its strength and it functioned well. It effectively was able to ensure what was the first task, actually, that was pacification and free trade, etc. Naturally, with all the difference of the case, think about the same Jews that rebelled thrice and ended effectively almost annihilated. The concept is you can belong to this. So this was already a very powerful message that naturally existed not just in the Roman Empire. Basically, all the great empires had been universal. This was the Alexandrian dream. This was the Persian dream. It was in China in the same way, albeit with different, with different ideas. How every empire was different in this regard. But let's say that Christianity looked at the empire, observing that this wasn't just an empire by chance Christ was born in, nor that it was just an empire like all the others, but it was effectively the universal empire. Now, in a modern secular perspective, we tend to conceive the Roman Empire as, in fact, something that, was just something finite, right? You can't represent its alleged borders on a map. That is quite, telling the truth, already a mistake, because effectively the Roman Empire didn't have borders. It's just expanded its military power over several peoples, and that was effectively the real thing. We think that there were naturally other peoples in the rest of the world, sometimes outside its frontiers, etc. But effectively, if you had seen it from the perspective of on average inhabitant of the empire at the time, the 1st century AD, you would have believed that was effectively the universal empire. Not just by ambition, but by de facto. And effectively they were. The Romans were to extend their geographical control in the 2nd century literally from Scotland to the Persian Gulf in a huge space that at the time was considered effectively the known world. Even if you look at maps of the time, the Romans had really conquered everything. You can't say, but they were just like the Caledonians up there, where not if it doesn't matter. They were still in the orbit of Rome, still even Germany, even all these populations, because they were absorbed by it. Rome was interested effectively only in controlling those areas that were economically remunerative. It's not that they gave up to conquer other neighboring regions simply because they couldn't, because they didn't have the strength. They simply calculated that it was not convenient by a sheer ratio of costs benefits, and they said, we can't simply control these guys from the external. They don't create problems. As long as the unity of the empire is preserved, everything's fine. Big mess is when the Romans start to effectively kill each other from the 3rd century onwards, and this gives, together with other factors that now we will skip, but we have been talking about them effectively many times. If you go into the Roman playlist history, you will find them, where to modify this equilibrium fundamentally. But it was really the universal empire, and this empire was properly a military empire. Our modernist perspective makes us always also forgetful, invariably, of also this factor that an empire like the Roman one wasn't just like an empire where, of course, where, let's say, the military was really detached from the institutions, right? Of course, from an administrative point of view, it was the case. The Roman army was controlled by a political body with appointed military leaders, commanders. It was logistical system that provided its permanence, its supplies. There was a statal machine at work now, and the more Rome went on, and the more fundamentally strengthened this control. But in general, the empire was in itself, as a political institution, a military institution. Like, this is not so intuitive, not so easy to understand, but this is really the idea. The empire is in fact the imperium. At this time, Rome was not really called the Roman Empire. It was called still Roman Republic, effectively, in imperial times. That there wasn't the concept that the empire was let's say, something that an institutional phase that had ceased to be. It was the Republic of the Romans that had this imperium. There was a capacity, fundamentally. It was given to them by the gods, and not just by one god, but a random god, but by the celestial deity of the skies, Jupiter Capitolinus. That is the equivalent in all Indo-Aryan religions of the great god of war, right? That is the one that effectively is able to confer victory, because victory and military glory do not belong to mankind. They only are given to by the gods to men, to virtuous men that have earned that because of their inner predisposition, with their also contact with the divinity and their prowess, generally speaking. If you're more interested about this concept, I've made several videos on the topic. Actually, there is one I made called Virtus Audacia Vut Vots Oder Furor Das Actias and Ferg, the Indo-European Sacred Fury. If you search for it, you should find it pretty easily. And also trying to spread this all but secular mindset that existed at the time towards even the legitimacy and if you wondered what was justifying, what was the raison d'être of the Roman Empire in itself, institutionally, it was in fact that it was a divine empire. The symbol of the Roman legions, the eagle, was the symbol of the celestial deity, of the military glory of the sky that descended on the Romans, because they were the most virtuous people. And this was to remain, even in the Middle Ages, as the core, fundamental, legal justification for the empire. Legal, moral, and absolute justification. So, when the Roman legions passed in places like Judea, with the eagle passing by, and they say, that was a nomen, in fact, a nomen that they shall conquer all against whom they march, as Josephus puts it, because effectively that was how the empire was believed to be, and it was divine. So even in a Christian perspective, it naturally was born out of a Jewish society. At this time, it's effectively difficult to tell, a Christian from a Jew, because fundamentally they were the same thing. Jesus Christ was a Jew. St. Paul was a Jew. Everything was in this Judaic dimension that had naturally a completely different idea of the world, of its own religion, the relation with the deity, etc. Had developed a very strong monotheism that, that there were kind of other monotheisms all around, but they weren't really quite so radical and absolute like Judaism and like Christianity would fundamentally be. So this world, however, had been affected by the idea that even military glory, if you read the Old Testament, it's full of that. It fundamentally comes from God. Military glory doesn't belong to mankind. You don't win an enemy because you're good in terms of skills, etc. You win only because God wants that. And just remember that when you study medieval military history, for instance, also, and you read the sources, you don't have to read them thinking, who is that here that won. You have to understand, what God decided, because that's how they thought it. Where God will decide, here shall be victory. This is the idea. So even from a the Christian perspective at this point, as especially in the case of St. Paul, that is in fact called the apostle of the Gentiles, so the apostle of the peoples fundamentally, so the other peoples that were not Jewish, effectively, and therefore he was embracing a universalistic idea of Christianity. Christianity was meant to be expanded. Everybody could become a Christian, so that effectively now not only Jews were the chosen people, but if you accepted Christ in your heart as your Lord and Savior, you belonged to the chosen people, the people of God. So you understand that this universalism was perfectly compatible with the Roman one. The Roman Empire had effectively been built through the extension of citizenship to foreigners. Rome has started expanding in this way and would have stopped otherwise by expanding citizenship progressively to the peoples that they conquered. Not because the Romans were doing it for charity, not because they gave a goddamn thing about foreigners. This myth that the ancient world was opened and completely devoid of discrimination is completely false. This was not a racist word, because racism didn't understand as an ideology, was a heavily xenophobic world, and it remained even throughout the Roman times. But the Romans had been clever, and there had been, however, a political struggle, internally speaking, that would remain over time in different ways for extended the citizenship, which didn't mean that you extended citizenship in block to just a province. This started happening towards the end, where now certain provinces had been effectively very deeply and strongly Romanized. That's what the edict of the Constitution Toniniana would be fundamentally at the beginning of the 3rd century, but that was a very advanced stage. Initially, the extension of citizenship had occurred through the effectively, it was the idea that if you came from a certain province, you could participate to the Roman state in some way, and you could earn citizenship. And this started from the elites. That's what the Romans were interested in, extending the citizenship to foreign elites in order to control them, to make them participate to the benefices of Roman political participation, and therefore through these leaders controlling all the clientele that they had. And since that was a clientelary world by definition, controlling also the relative populations, and in the meanwhile Romanizing through material culture, to trade, etc., at the point that these populations would be effectively incorporated into the Roman Empire after generations, without even having done much effort for, probably most of the peoples Rome conquered weren't at all happy to be conquered by the Romans, but their elites were definitely, sometimes they were forced, because also in here the elite, not even the elites liked much the idea, but still the Romans were in this sense quite generous, considering the time standards where just you could arrive and slaughter whoever you wanted, and this is why Rome created a universal empire, whereas all the other empires that had existed in the West had vanished, because they hadn't refueled, let's say, the strengths and the physical and moral strengths of their citizenry, or however the only ones who were in charge in this way. So from a polling perspective, naturally you understand that if Christianity has been born in the empire, and the empire is a universal one, and the Christian message is universal, you see that the two things overlap. So the objective was to expand the Christian message all over the empire, with no exceptions, and even beyond, because naturally Christianity expanded actually pretty quickly, even outside, from the eastern side, even into places like Persia, etc. Even it arrived by the 6th century to China. China was effectively Christianized in large chunks in the early Middle Ages, in order to be eventually so that was eventually the influences was erased. But The empire, naturally speaking, especially as the power that was effectively controlling Jerusalem, and that now all the communities that from it, thanks to St. Paul, were spreading around the Mediterranean and even entering continental Europe, was the one who the Christians had to deal with in their everyday life. Because aside from the martyrs, that are the ones that, if you read the geography, had this actually very extremistic approach to Christian faith, at the point of being willingly killed, just not to commit apostasy by burning that a pinch of incense on the altar to the imperial deity. The majority of the Christians actually just simply did it metaphorically. There were certain fathers of the church that also sometimes said, okay, well, if the point is to get killed, just do it, and just in your heart remain Christian, and just make a certain penitence, but it's not a big deal. But initially the Christians were developing this idea that, okay, the empire doesn't have to impose me this kind of religious request. The Romans, by the way, were very tolerant for those time standards. First of all, the Romans never adopted this persecutory measures in an homogeneous way. Kind of every governor could do whatever he wanted. And naturally there was a very big problem because of the unrest, etc. In the case of St. Paul, that is particularly meaningful. He causes a mess in Jerusalem. He's arrested. He escapes death. And the Roman authorities immediately intervene, as they had intervened with Jesus, effectively putting him to death, because the local the priesthood of Jerusalem had wanted so, in avoiding the revolt. In Palestine, as we will see, in Judea, actually in Judea or Judaea, as you also may want to call it, that effectively were revolted and created quite serious problems in the Near East because of that. But the point I wanted to make is that great part of the Roman Empire, in this sense, and the civic sense of belonging, had to do with the militia. I mean, at this time, of course, the Roman military was mostly about volunteers. The Romans didn't have effectively endemic problems. They could recruit at this point whoever they wanted. This is something they could do effectively up to the 3rd century without any single problem. It was the moment of greatest expansion of Rome. The recruitment problems had occurred just fundamentally in the 2nd century BC. Then with the Marian reforms, this has been put to an end, and it was not the deal. So the military service was actually not compulsory at this time. Theoretically, the authorities could call for, in case of emergency, for certain communities that were not even Roman to participate to arms. In fact, even during the Jewish revolts, this happened. That together with the Roman legions, there were certain troops recruited from here and there, all around, like in Egypt and in the Near East, that of allies, etc., were brought to fight for Rome. That was actually pretty normal, as the Roman army has effectively always had more foreign troops on the ground at any stage of its history than actual Roman citizen soldiers. But the idea is that the militia was something extremely meaningful in the Roman perspective and in the perspective of the average Roman subject, because first of all, it was the same essence of the empire. Empires, as you said before, were all about war. I mean, the standard aim of any empire at the time was effectively to conquer the world. Doesn't matter where you were the smallest, stinkiest tribe of northern Europe that couldn't even control a few tens of square kilometers around its village, or the greatest empires like Rome or China. Your objective was theoretically to prove that we're the strongest guy, right? To say, okay, we're the mightiest empire that has to ultimately conquer the world by divine will. This was effectively something that the Romans also shared with the so-called barbarians. I mean, the Aryan military glory is effectively the same in Rome, among the Celts, among the Germans, even among non-Indo-European peoples. And the same symbol of the eagle was to remain effectively, was used by many other peoples, and because it corresponded to a common anthropological understanding of reality of the world, of how the celestial deity was the mightiest one, especially from the... okay, but we have talked about this. The point, though, is, aside from the ideology, there was a pretty, and probably even more imposant and stronger perspective, was the crude material one. I mean, in front of the rising Christianity, there were the soldiers of Rome. These were, in the 1st century AD at least, a terrific example of efficiency, of safety, of loyalty, of discipline. These were kind of and these qualities would remain in great part unaltered throughout time. And they were something that effectively the ancient world had never seen. Let's be honest about this. No other empire out there had been able to provide this stable political and military system like Rome had done. It was something impressive. Excuse me 1 second. Put myself at ease. So, For this very reason, I mean, the Romans had earned it. This was also seen in divine perspective. The Romans had conquered lots of peoples. They had destroyed some of what were considered even the greatest powers of the time. Think about the same Jews that had seen the successors ruling over them, etc. Now, effectively, Rome had conquered Syria, had conquered Egypt, also naturally Palestine, and proving that, and wiping them out, and basically ensuring the Mediterranean a period of prosperity. The Romans have literally wiped out all the piracy. They were ensuring order. They were stationing their troops everywhere and protecting the borders, or the frontiers, let's say better, and making this great fundamentally Hellenistic world that the Mediterranean one was flourishing at this time. St. Paul was living exactly in this moment of greatest prosperity that arguably the world had never seen up to that time. So, new faith needed definitely a similar instrument to conquer the souls. I mean, just like the Romans had made it to materially, let's say, conquer the world, now the Christians said, okay, we need the same thing, but, imitating Christ in his ways, etc., not using violence, but, or better, not using violence in a certain way, and effectively convincing from a spiritual point of view. This was the same ambition. This was a model that couldn't be ignored. Because the Roman military was the most fearful thing that the world at that point had ever seen. This was very important, politically speaking, because, as we have said, all this local population effectively still retained a great part of their political autonomy. Rome controlled them, told them what to do. They effectively Romanized them. They disarmed them many times, but they were still, communities ruled by, the local elites, as we've seen, etc. So, even politically speaking, this was a great problem. You couldn't really escape Rome. Look at what happened, in fact, with the Jewish wars, when the Romans basically even station a whole legion with our auxiliary complements, etc., to just besiege the fortress of Masada with a manifold of rebels in there. This was truest even in the Jewish perspective, because in Jewish history, actually revolt religiously led was actually a big thing. You know, the Jews had effectively revolted, for instance, against the Seleucids, had suffered this. And they had been a warlike people back in the day. They had always been fighting. It was effectively a military understanding of reality. Also in the Old Testament, when God was called, in fact, to fight alongside the Jews. And the Jewish Messiah, as it is still today, is considered not as, and that's why effectively the Jews do not recognize Christ as the Messiah, is that he has to be a political and military leader. I mean, he has really to do certain things. He has to be a real power, a real ruler, or a real leader. So, and from the Christian side, the idea is that, you know, Jesus is something else, and you can find in the prophecies of the Old Testament even the fact that he would have come as fundamentally as a miserable, you know, as a sort of an outcast that was rejected from the majority, etc. But, you know, still these are two worlds that went two different ways. So in the Jewish thought and the Pauline thought in consequently was definitely imbued with this sense of violence, even if you know, even Christian language is something that is widely overlooked. But I mean, Jesus' words are extremely violent. I mean, if you really look at the Gospels, you realize that it says something that is effectively terrible, because it's absolute. It's something. I used this term also before, totalitarian, in the sense that it really encompasses the whole human dimension. So it has to be radical. The Christian message is deeply radical in its essential, because otherwise you can't follow the Christian, the Christ-like model. The approach, however, is very different from Judaism, as you understand. So this was a serious problem. It's not that at this point Christianity was well defined effectively, as there were several branches. St. Peter, effectively, that had gone to Rome, etc., had maintained the more traditional Jewish perspective, for which, if it had been for him, his followers, Christianity would have remained Judaic in nature. St. Paul effectively stands this in a completely at a completely different level, and also creating, in this sense, a contrast. If you read St. Paul's life, about St. Paul's life, you realize wherever you go, he risked effectively to be he was aggressed several times. He risked to be flanked, to be excuse me, not to be flanked. What the hell, stupid. Okay, sorry, I had technical problems. Lynched, however, that he wanted to, you know, he risked several times to be killed, and that's also where the same Roman authorities, as a Roman citizen, had saved him, and had actually, he had asked to be his case to be brought in front of the emperor, and as a Roman citizen he could get that, he had that right fundamentally, and that in fact what happened, because he was brought in Rome for that reason. So, but the problem of militia as the exercise of arms in this sense is the key, because it's an exercise of arms both from a spiritual point of view, in Christianly speaking. So if you look at the language that the apostle of the Gentiles used, you realize that it's full, literally full of symbols and let's say comparisons inspired to the Roman military life. I will read from the, that were effectively written in Greek, but I read from the Vulgata in Latin. For instance, this from the letters of the Epistle to the Romans, 13:12. Abiciamus ergo opera tenebrarum et induamur arma lucis. Now, or to read it in the, let's read it in the Restituta pronunciation. Abiciamus ergo opera tenebrarum et induamur arma lucis. So this literally means let's fundamentally get stripped of the works of the darkness of the and let's wear the armor of light, right? So this is pretty powerful here. He's saying to effect. Well, okay, we will comment them later. This other one from 2 Corinthians 6:7. Arma justitiae a dextris et a sinistris. So this is effectively just take the offensive and defensive weapons of justice. So take the sword and the shield of justice, divine justice, naturally. This other one, induite vos armaturam Dei, ut possitis stare adversus insidias diaboli. State ergo succinti lumbos vestros in veritate et induti lorica justitiae, et calceati pedes in praeparatione et evangelii pacis, in omnibus sumentes scutum fidei, in quo possitis omnia tela nequissimi ignei extinguere. Et Galeam salutis assumite et gladium spiritus quod est verbum Dei. This is from Ephesians 6:11, 14, 17, which means to make it, just wear the armor of God in order to resist the assaults of the devil. So therefore stay protected in truth and covered with the armor of justice, and let's say fit into the firmly fit into the gospel of peace, and bearing the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish the fire arrows of the devil, and take the helm of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, that is the word of God. Then from here, sobri simus induti loricam fidei et caritatis et galeam spem salutis. This is first translating, it says let's be sober, wearing the armor of faith and charity, and that helm that is the hope for salvation. Then labora sicut bonus miles Christi Jesu. This is powerful. This is 2 Timotheus 2:3. That is effectively work or bear, let's say, the just deal with the difficulties that as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. So you understand that these are very strongly military oriented. This is strongly military oriented language, right? And this really is this is a kind of phrasery, let's say, that had to be a huge influence on the for instance, on chivalric liturgy during the Middle Ages, because just think about, the Frankish warriors, barely Christianized, who started reading these things and said, okay, this is about arms. This is really something about which I know something about, and this was really taken literally. I mean, as if these were really real armors and swords and shields and helmets, etc. And they are words, however, that in itself contain an extremely strong violence. It is the same one that characterizes the Christian message, because this is, as we were saying before, it's a radical thinking. you don't have to accept Jesus just, so simply, okay, let's do it. You really have to prepare for fighting, to struggle, because it's going to be divisive. Christ says, I came with the sword, and I will tear basically families apart. My message will do this, and just know that these things will happen. So the Christian message is terrible and has to scare, because otherwise it wouldn't have any deterrent effect. It wouldn't effectively prepare and predispose the mind and the heart for the task that the Christian message comes humanity to carry out. And it's very important to stress the violence of this lexicon, because otherwise the Christian message wouldn't have any meaning. So as metaphorical as these weapons and armor can be, still this was a message that could be understood. I mean, the idea that these words were not used just to describe the metaphor at an ideal from an ideal point of view, but that these were words that were presented in front of subjects of the Roman Empire who perfectly knew what war was in that sense, of what it meant to wear an armor, to bear arms. Just think that at the time, effectively, the only allowed, the military men were recognized effectively for their weapons, not because they wore a uniform like in modern times, but because they were wearing things like the cingulum militaris, for instance. It was such a strong concept, and the empire, and let's say the Roman society, was going slowly to evolve towards towards a transformation that would increasingly give importance to armament. Like with the crisis of the 3rd century, you see that society impoverishes, the military starts becoming sort of a professional case that, okay, also the rest of the people now are being called once again to arms, even if they don't want to. But in this sense, there is this contrast, increasing contrast between who bear arms and who instead just is everybody else that plugs the land. It's in a nutshell what medieval society will be. So these arms, these weapons, especially when the empire will become Christian, will assume a meaning that goes far beyond. I mean, when the empire is effectively invaded by foreign peoples that are not even Christian, that put the local society at risk and devastate. In fact, the military answer is at this point not just a merely pragmatic one. It's just still a divine one, and it had always been like that. I mean, with the Christian message, it assumes a new meaning, naturally, that is also interpreted, because as we will see now, what St. Paul was writing here was not meant to be, taken as, let's take arms for real. On quite the contrary, we will see that there is a strict differentiation in the Christian message between taking arms spiritually and for real, actually, which you shouldn't do, hopefully, or at least theoretically, or at least it's still a sin to kill, and this was still also in Judaism. There was effectively a great sense of morality that we have also erased from our understanding. I mean, before I stressed how also, monotheism was different, etc., but it's not that also the pagan world was devoid of concept like, killing is bad. That is something that has always existed, humanly speaking, and it's also the deal of theism and all other religions to basically prove that this is actually a natural and therefore a divine law that shouldn't be broken as a universal law. But here, naturally, it was easy to confuse. It was easy, actually. These were words that were used exactly in order to be ambiguous. So there were a sort of bait for those who, maybe they were not really interested into Christianity, but so into this kind of vocabulary, something that could really relate with, something that maybe they had experienced firsthand. We know that, in fact, there were many Christian soldiers in the Roman Empire at this time, and that effectively their problem was not even to be in the army, but just to make it to kill people, the enemies of the empire. But just the problem was not to make the sacrifice to the Christian emperor. So you realize that how so many levels actually this message was spread, and how in practice, especially the average, let's say, Christian Roman subject was actually well inserted into society most of the times, and or better, of course, the majority of the Christians weren't actually very well off at the beginning. They were usually, in fact, outcasts. That the same, if you look at where the Christian message spread the first among people, among fishermen, among prostitutes, among people that were effectively also in that society kind of not very important. But we start seeing from effectively, even if you look at the Dacian campaigns or the campaigns of Marcus Aurelius, you realize that there were Christian legionnaires at the time already. So these were Roman citizens, just like St. Paul effectively had been. So these were people who were believing in God, in the Christian God, without probably posing themselves too many problems relatively to certain aspects of let's say, of Christian conduct. Here it's there will be a lot to say, let's say, concerning this, but let's say that because there was already a kind of a Christian direction, it was pretty clear. Killing has always been a sin in Christianity, so this was probably known, but at the same time, these principles were declined into the actual people that learned about them. It's something that, as you can understand, could be very heterogeneous, and this would last for centuries. I mean, for centuries, even when the Roman Empire was Christianized, even in early medieval times, people were, say, Christian, but we don't have to think that they, being Christian meant to actually understand the Christian message at its fullest, nor that this message was really exclusive of any other belief. Paganism and Christianity actually coexisted in the same people for centuries, even up to very recent times. We know it, especially in the countryside of Europe. Just think about certain beliefs that naturally were not the same. It's not that their people were effectively pagan, but certain beliefs that, irrationally speaking, remained, however, pretty alive from the ancient times, and that had not created consistent problem. So here, as you understood, the Pauline message that we have observed in these phrases is definitely martially oriented, not just in the objective, in material dimension of armament, etc., but also in a kind of spiritual, and obviously in a spiritual predisposition. You have to make labor, that is effectively to work, to do something tough, even physically, not just spiritually. You have to be a good soldier of Jesus Christ. These are the textual words. So this meant that the military message was adopted as an active duty in real life. So it wasn't just about a formality. It was really making a life of war in many ways, against the temptations, against the devil, etc. But at the same time, aside from the interpretations, like aside from what these words were kind of reinterpreted over time, etc., the Pauline message still implied no positive judgment in itself towards war, towards real war, towards real weapons, towards real military service. At the same time, on the contrary, it kind of was, presenting the Christians with an alternative. So what we're saying is, may your sword be the word of God. Or better, let be the word of God be your sword. Let hope be your helm. So and so on. So as you understand, the message here is you don't need, aside from the word of God and hope, etc., any other mundane help. So you don't actually need a sword. You don't actually need a helmet. You need something that works as them and that lives within you, and that makes you go on, say, armed and protected, but not in a metaphorical way, not actually in a practical way. So the exhortation, for instance, to Timotheus to behave as a good soldier of Christ continues in something like this. Nemo militans Deo implicat se negotis saceula ut ei placeat cui se probavit. So this is the second letter to Timotheus 2:4. So it basically means, in fact, for excuse me, I was reading another thing. It meant nobody who serves in the army of God lets himself, let's say, being influenced, being to get into mundane affairs, fundamentally, because this is the will of those to whom he has entrusted himself, that is God, naturally. So mundane life passes in the background, fundamentally. It's not important anymore. This is actually in many ways the strongest message of Christian religion, especially given the context, in the historical context in which it was expressed. Because the mundane affairs at this time were not considered like something negative. On the contrary, even in Judaism, Judaism was already relatively diversified at this time, but obviously Judaism has a much more legalistic approach. It's much more based on actions than feelings, and even in the Roman world, effectively mundane life was what defined a true man. Because mundane life was everything. The Romans didn't have really a private life in the sense we intended. Even if you look at the place where they lived in kind of very small places that they went into just to sleep. The whole life was outside in the forum, dealing with with other people, economically, politically, and trying to put in motion this world and to make it functioning fundamentally. So even the concept of munus that was at the base of Roman civism, that was essentially both a reward and a duty in many ways. It was really in a nutshell what the Roman society was all about. A world where you have to constantly interact, where you don't have to treasure your own good to save it for something else, for another world, let's say, even metaphorically, but you have to invest continuously in this world, because otherwise society stops and collapses. So when Christ says that the mundane world has to be abandoned, this is not also in here, it's an ambiguous phrase. I mean, it has to be interpreted evidently. And even in Christian terms, it doesn't literally mean that you have to live out of the world. Otherwise, there wouldn't even be a church, fundamentally. But rather, you have still to make all of your life about Christ, about the spiritual dimension, and let all the rest follow, even into actual real life, because we are constantly at the same time in our inner spiritual dimension, in the kind of the exterior social one. Even if we don't want, then naturally there were kind of some extremistic behaviors, like the ones of hermits, etc., that were, as we've said many times, actually in several videos on Schwerpunkt, nothing new. I mean, Christian monasticism is also something that is born out of, so many other monasticisms. The Judaic world knew them, the Buddhist world knew them, even the Hellenic world knew them. But in general, every kind of world, basically, even the tribal world knew, in this sense, this isolation of the word. I mean, monasticism in the literal sense of the word. But these were, even Christ goes out there alone in the desert without anything, but it's just an episode of his life. For the rest, he's a social person. He has his apostles. He goes around cities. He lives into them. He knows people. He participates to parties, to events. He talks to masses. So even in the Christian message, this is not to abandon mundane life doesn't quite mean, just to be a recluse de facto. Then even this was interpreted in different ways. Even the same concept of monasticism was born out of the extremization of this thing, but it was still considered as a free interpretation of the believer, something acceptable and divinely inspired, so that even some of the greatest saints were in fact monks that spent their life not really much of isolation, but many of them also obviously had this experience, and sometimes brought it also to some kind of extreme consequence. Think about the Stilies, etc. So it's a quality difference. It's a qualitative difference, because in this case, the two types of militia that St. Paul is talking about are reciprocally extraneous. They don't have any real point in common. This is why the Christian message is so radical, so tranchant, because effectively it tells you, your spiritual matter, your spiritual concerns should be so important that even if the rest exists, you should bend that to fundamentally your spiritual ones. So this doesn't actually mean that they cannot coexist, because naturally also Christianity at one point had, as we've seen, had to solve the problem of, what do? We have become an empire. Shouldn't we have a military? Of course we should have a military, like any sensible society on earth. And therefore these two types of militias that St. Paul is talking about are two completely different, but doesn't mean that they can't coexist in many ways. And there is this other passage that kind of leaves no doubt about this meaning. This is from 2 Corinthians 10:34. In carne enim ambulantes non secundum carnem militamus, nam arma militiae nostrae non carnalia sunt. So this is this means in fact even if we actually walk into flesh, we actually do not render our service to God according to flesh. In fact, the arms of our militia are not bodily. So the Christian duty, however, is militia. So Christian duty is militia. The Christian life, the Christian spiritual experience is a true battle. It is, and it is all about this struggle between effectively good and evil that has to make you understand the value of sacrifice, of sufferance, of hard work, of discipline, of self-discipline. So all things that pertain to militia, to the real militia as well. Then St. Paul, in this sense, lacks a positive judgment towards serving in the army, right? But at the same time, it's also lacking its opposite. In other words, the Christians are not actually expressing their opinion towards the military, saying, the military is bad, you shouldn't be there. Not at all. This is not the point. In St. Paul, you don't find any positive definitely you don't find any positive judgment towards the army, to serving, taking, bearing arms. But at the same time, you also don't have its opposite. It doesn't say, don't bear arms, or do not serve in the army, or there is not, because this is beyond. So there is always a spiritual life and a secular life for the Christian, and the two things are effectively separated, but they're still part of his. I mean, they're not separated for him, that you have to say either one or the other. They're simply not overlapping, because the spiritual affairs are intrinsically different from the secular affairs. And what actually St. Paul says about politics, and therefore in Clausewitzian terms, those who bear arms effectively, is that telling the truth, recommending the obedience to public powers, perfectly in line with the Jewish tradition, like saying, do not make mess, obey power, because power is there, because God actually has put him there. Now we don't open the parenthesis on this, because we will do it surely one day, but not now. But just for saying that there is still an implicit appreciation, at least for real power, for who is effectively in charge and who bears arms, incidentally. So here we're talking about the Romans, effectively. So if we were to put in opposition the Militia Dei and the Saecularia Negotia, this is restituta. I know I should say Militia Dei and Saecularia Negotia, but this is more or less what we think they said it. But no. In Pauline thought, we would also force the message as much as talking about approval of the equivalence of the divine militia, the Christian militia, in the secular affairs, because when we have just explained it, but this also brings to another element, that is, spiritual affairs, however, in the Christian perspective, should have the priority on the secular ones, when they come into contrast, at least. So this is also what partly drove the problems in the Roman military concerning those Christian soldiers that were already soldiers, but who effectively didn't want to shed blood, or to make actually most of the times it was about not making the imperial, not accepting the imperial office. Now, believe that the Roman army had a religion in itself. These were troops that brought the imperial insignia with the image of the emperor, with the Roman eagle, which was the symbol of celestial deity. So this brought to some disciplinary problems that, as we have said before, weren't anything majority in the whole in the army, not especially even when the Roman army was effectively made chiefly by Christians that kept serving and fighting just as any other soldier at all times. But geography tells us about these various saints that ironically were in fact martyrized according to tradition for having refused to shed blood, but that in the tradition, in the Christian tradition, in popular tradition, became actually military saints in the sense that they actually were conceived as soldiers fighting against, metaphorical enemies, but it's in practice as real enemies. Like in the Christian tradition, military saints were prayed, were venerated for military reasons. Like saying, let's bring St. George to battle because he will effectively help us crush our enemies. And we realize that in the geography, these saints had basically refused to crush their enemies, in the sense physically. So this is just another element that shows you how effectively the Christianization of the army didn't bring to any concrete change. And this naturally happened also for a kind of relative misunderstanding, because it kind of went the other way, but at the same time the reverse is not kind of true. This is the thing that I wanted to express, to explain today in itself. That definitely Christian message is not advocating for actual violence. It's not saying go out and kill your enemy. It doesn't say anything like that. But at the same time, it doesn't say this in the world is not supposed to happen, because whatever it happens is still because of God's wish, and this had necessarily to happen in some way. So there has also to be necessarily someone who enacted it and carried it out. And in the obedience to the political authority is a proof also of the relative support, the relative endorsement to this, that at least from the believers as a community, even by the church itself, because there is someone out there who has to do that and has to sin. One of the greatest problems of early Christianity, at least at a disciplinary level in the formal sphere was to say, okay, what do we do about Christian soldiers who shed blood as a living? Well, especially in the Byzantine tradition, there was a sort of things were very seriously, if not handled, at least conceived. I made a video about this that is, if you give me a second, that was about the penitentials in the early Middle Ages, that are very important, because the title here is Bloodshed and Penance in Early Medieval Europe. Well, this is interesting because I made it by making a sort of comparison between also Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And you realize that Western Europe, on average, was way more, was more easygoing than the East, at least formally, at least prescriptively, towards the punishments that had necessarily to be inflicted to those who had sinned by killing, even in a just war. So this is kind of important, because you see how eventually Christianity kind of catalyzed this problem by saying, okay, We shed blood, and then we have to be punished for it. But still, we need that. Still, in our political life, we need an army. We need to who bears arms, right? So even if the Gospels do not advocate for that, still there has to be a protection for the Christian people. That there has to be someone who stays there, and albeit sinning, so also putting himself at the at risk of, in fact, of having his spirit damaged by this, because it's definitely something that doesn't stop even to the fact of having killed someone. It's what brings you to kill someone, and that's why, in fact, there is also a great emphasis in terms of defense, self-defense, etc., because that was naturally in part the first justification. After all, in the Bible, even in the Old Testament, there is the concept that the evil can be killed effectively, that there is some good in the idea of killing the evil guy, right? I mean, it's still a sin, but it's possible, and it's for good. So the Christian message is not really incompatible with the secular militia, albeit actually not talking about it. So this is actually the great depth and in subtleness of the Christian message, because if effectively it really shifts the whole story on a completely different level. And at that time, it was unbelievable. I mean, and the great problem that the Christianity posed, in fact, to the empire was this shift towards the inner side that was tied to the transcendental, to what effectively in the world really didn't have an action. The pagans believed, in fact, that there was a direct connection between actions and divine reaction, if you want, to it. In Christianity, it was radically different. It was an absolute standard that you had to follow, and that you couldn't because you were already doomed because of sin, basically, in origin. Then you could redeem yourself, but only because of God's grace. So you had naturally to work for it. You had in part to deserve it. So to predispose yourself to salvation, in order to not to let your soul being poisoned by vices, by crimes, etc. But at the same time, it was shifting the aim at another level that society was not understanding effectively, because that society was based on contractualism. That was paganism, was in a nutshell. It was right. It was right. Ritualism. So I even made a video about this that is called. That was in the Viking era. Said in Viking era, it was Christian faith and Germanic rite. The religious syncretism of the North, something like that. And this is even all the more interesting because it actually shows in that context that on some levels the two things could still coexist. Because, in fact, the right and belief were on such different levels that were not interfering, theoretically. In the case of the Christians, it interfered with the Roman Empire because the Roman Empire required that sacrifice to the imperial deity. Because that was meant to say, okay, if everybody makes it, we can assume that gods will be thankful towards us. If someone doesn't, the whole thing will fall all over the rest of society. This was the real problem. If there was a natural disaster, the ancients believed that because it was someone who had angered the gods, so you couldn't not make a sacrifice to the gods, because that would have to the imperial deity actually. Then for the rest you could believe whatever you liked, even including Christianity or Judaism. So it was perfectly fine. But you also had to integrate that, and the Christians refused it because of this formalism that in some cases was surpassed also by the same Christians, saying, okay, well, you shouldn't really do this sacrifice, but if you're, let's say, the alternative is you to be killed, your family to be enslaved, well, do it, because it's still better than, if you don't believe it, it's fine. You commit kind of a small sin compared to the one of having yourself killed, which is kind of interesting because the original geographic mindset attitude was radically different. I mean, theoretically, in fact, the early martyrs had to be killed, to literally let themselves be killed, even if the same Roman government said something like, are you sure? Look, that I'm gonna kill you. I give you extra time. Don't do it. Just make this small sacrifice, and everything will go fine. And asking twice and twice. We have actually the ether, the procedural ether of this, and even Roman persecutions weren't this massive bloodbaths that eventually naturally the Christian geography emphasized, because they were constructing their own view of the thing, their own version of the story. But the reality was very different, and probably the majority of Christians were fine actually with both things. And at that point, however, it's difficult to track them, singularly speaking, because effectively we started having mostly Christian sources at that time. The Christian source was mainly concerned with ecclesiological problems that were, let's say, the most... I'm not saying that they weren't important in real life, but they maybe were relatively ideal, while the rest of the believers, or whoever belonged to the church formally, didn't quite perform in the way that they were expected to. So, yeah, this is also another aspect. So, if Pauline symbology is posed on the threshold of a great problem, as you have understood, of Christian spirituality, which is in fact the one of the Militia Christi, that effectively was posed mostly, we think, between the 1st and the 2nd century AD, or at least it kind of matured mostly, because you see that it was present since the beginning, but it was probably accelerated by the great conquests of Trajan, especially, because that Trajan conquered Dacia, conquered Mesopotamia, had this very strong militarily oriented policies that evidently impressed the whole world, because at that point the Roman Empire expanded enormously and reached its moment of maximal territorial, extensionally speaking, of the territorial expansion. So even Christian society at the time, it was start being substantial in the beginning of the 2nd century, had to respond to it, not necessarily in a negative fashion, but saying, okay, we have to fundamentally start embracing the military ideal, or at least in order to be embraced as a community, we have to prove that there is an analogy between what we are doing as a Christian and what the secular world does. That was evidently praised, because Trajan campaigns were not only a success, at least in the military operation itself and the outcome, but they effectively were a propagandistic mean. Thinking about the Trajan column, how this was portrayed in the empire, in front of the people, etc. So also in front of the Christians, and who now felt obliged to develop their own theory of militia that could be presented to the secular world. So what is important is that the Roman military, let's say the Roman military value, was based on the concept of virtus, and we have explained what this meant in that video I told you before about the Indo-European sacred fury. That is basically in the Latin sum of virtues, basically the ultimate virtue. It's like the sum of all the greatest virtues of all. So it's the perfect man. That it's not just, however, an ideal, balanced Aristotelic man. The Roman vir is the military man. Is a strong and valorous man. Is a man who bears arms and that has obtained that is virtually, say, is the key for obtaining military glory from the skies, from the deity. So in a Christian sense, the virtue had to be something very similar to it. So becoming effectively Christ-like. So these are what effectively even the Roman virtues, the same Roman virtues were modified in Christian times to become effectively Christian virtues. They bore the same name, but with slightly different meanings that were now Christianly oriented, but there were still religious meanings. Virtue was a term used naturally also in Latin literature now to address this the Greek terms that were defining all these other philosophical virtues of sometimes even atheistic philosophies coming from the East, etc., that had nothing to do with the idea of virtus as in the eminently warlike quality of the real man, right? So Christianity, in this sense, retakes also parts of its of the ancient, collects part of the ancient original meaning of the word virtue, meant really as a warrior. I mean, the Christian virtues help to fight effectively against Satan. It's a real fight, and basically the whole Christian symbolism from the beginning to the end is imbued with this concept, the idea that you have spiritual weapons against which you enact a true battle against evil, against temptations, so it's all metaphorical, but nevertheless it could go both ways. In the real life of the Christians, this ideology could also support and kind of favor, at least, the use of arms for a good that naturally had to be assessed as such, in the sense that you can't kill people without punishment. You can't you can't take started to venerate war in itself as if you have to still remain a Christian, of course, but at the same time your spirit can help you carry out certain duties that are also necessarily present in secular life, just like the military service, and therefore the military action. And in this sense, through this semantic data, we can say that Christianity discovered his metaphysical vocation, predisposition towards war, towards the idea of spiritual war, a metaphysical war, a war that was fought between good and evil, and that is present in the very first, take the eagle that is symbol of St. John Gospel and read what's the prologue to St. John's Gospel. It's a struggle between good and evil. There is a victory entailed. So this naturally goes much. There would be tons of things to say about this. Even looking at the Gospels, reading them, and understanding Christian messages, something way more violent than we can imagine. Because there can't be any commitment without violence. This is the truth, I believe, and this is what the Judeo-Christian tradition, in my opinion, has perfectly understood, and explains, and therefore the Christian ambiguity in this sense is way more. It's even more representative of human nature as such. There's a lot of Clausewitzian in it. I wouldn't like to draw this parallelism now because it's complicated, but it's effectively as if you know what we talk about von Clausewitz, and we observe the theory that fundamentally is there, and this is how things are supposed to work. It's a bit like Christ, like the principles, what you can't attain, not even if you give yourself, but still real life, secular life bogs you down. It traps you, and you're obliged to control and modify this intense because of the contingent factors that effectively, in the Christian sense, oblige you to sin. So to do something imperfectly, but still driven for the ultimate goal. So this is particularly important because it's not imbued with legalism that says, it just says for you to obey the Mosaic law and everything is fine. You also have to have an inner predisposition. You have to be able to look to look beyond, to understand, not just to follow, but to lead in some way, which is a very aggressive mindset. That's why the Christian message is beautiful, because its aggressiveness is necessary for salvation. You can't be saved without a fight. You can't be saved without taking arms, without standing in front of an enemy. And this is an extremely deep philosophical message. This is really the reality of human existence, of human condition. You can't hope that things are going to be solved by themselves. But in order to solve them, you have to stain your hands, sometimes even with blood. This is what effectively the vagueness of the Christian message hints to, in my opinion, that you can't escape from that. You're not perfect, which doesn't mean you have to do it, but it will have to happen in some ways. The Christian message in this sense, also there are many prophecies that you should understand that talk consistently about war. This was a world where war was something really, and people suffer in their own skin. So sometimes it's definitely passively meant, because Christian society is meant to be to suffer, to be persecuted, to have its members killed. Jesus Christ is effectively killed on the cross after terrible torture. But at the same time, what you see is, St. Peter, who cuts off a Roman legionary, a guard's ear with his knife. Why is St. Peter armed? What does that mean? That detail, for instance, was used especially to convert particularly warlike peoples, like the Saxons, where they were conquered by the Carolingians, were totally in love with that episode of the Gospels, because they saw in Christ a warrior chieftain with his military retinue of the apostles. They were armed, just like a Germanic war band, like the time in Saxony, in 8th century Saxony. So 9th century Saxon. So yeah, this is really so that war is never a justification, violence is never justified in a Christian perspective, but at the same time you won't go without a fight. And even the idea of offering the other cheek, like saying that is metaphoric. That means something way different than just do not react. That means go your own way. Don't let test yourself, in other words. Be tough at the point of not caring, even for that abuse, if what you truly believe it's the right thing to do is about, because that's really what it means. And sometimes that also entails having to defend, even with violence as necessary, what you and now I'm oversimplifying, of course, but there is not one unique interpretation. No thought has ever been historically interpreted, which is the text, historically speaking, that has always been interpreted in a single fashion. Do we want to talk about the Bible? Every man has a different reaction. Every human being has a different understanding. And Christianity, in this sense, is taking into consideration this aspect. Therefore, it's not talking by actual manuals and direction. It simply gives you an awareness. And this is the greatness of this, though, in my opinion. And we will definitely come back pretty thoroughly in this topic and on many others, because there is to talk about all the other, about martyrdom, about the military tradition. Actually, the same Jesuit message, also in Judaism. There's plenty of things to talk about. We will do it sometime. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.